Hi, I'm Geoff Calkins from the Daily Memphian, and thanks, that was Kirk Whalum, who you just heard with the introduction. My family has a tradition of reading Christmas stories. My great-great-uncle was a minister in Boston, Massachusetts, and he had children's sermons that he bound into a book. And all my Christmases growing up, we read these stories, one a day on Christmas. And then when I got married and we all launched off the 9 kids in our own families, we were all given a copy of these books, and we all made this a tradition of our own. And so every year I typically have a Christmas party where I read one of these stories. Well, this year, for obvious reasons, we are not having a Christmas party, but the Christmas spirit prevails. And so 2 friends, Kirk Whalum and Scott Morris, are going to help me with a reading today of one of Uncle Raymond's Christmas stories. So I hope you gather around with your kids and a little mulled cider and a fire and join us in this family tradition, our sort of Christmas card to you. And they were wise men, and they were kings, and he was only a little child. Yet everybody seemed to do the same thing before that manger. They all got onto their knees. They all bowed before him. The wise men did, and the shepherds did, and later the disciples did. And you and I are tonight. Why? Because Jesus was love, and everything must bow to love. The proudest, the haughtiest, the cruelest, the meanest people in the world must bow to love. And let anyone have in him the love of Jesus, and he can make anyone bow before that love. And I want to tell you how someone proved that. My story to you this year is about Miss Blakely's Christmas. Now, Miss Blakely was a rather peculiar woman. You know that some people are, and she was one of them. I do not know just how old Miss Blakely was. You are not supposed to know how old some people are. It is not important to know just how old she was, because so far as children are concerned, when a person gets to be 30 or 40 years of age, they are old. And I know for a fact that Miss Blakely was older than that. And as I have said, she was peculiar. For one thing, she lived all alone in a big house by herself, and anyone who does that is certainly peculiar. For another thing, she did not like to have anybody to come see her. Then she built great big fence all around her lovely lawns and gardens with a huge iron gate that was usually kept locked. Then everybody said she was cross and stingy. And if everybody said so, I guess it must have been true. And everybody stood in awe of her and never went near her. And so now you know what Miss Blakely was like. Well, a few months before this Christmas of hers that I'm going to tell you about, a new family moved into the comfortable little bungalow at the end of the street where Miss Blakely lived. There were 3 members of that family. There was Mr. Harriet, and he was the head bookkeeper at Harvey's department store. Then there was Mrs. Harriet, and she gave music lessons. And then there was Jane Harriet, about 12 years old. And she is the real heroine of our story, and you boys need not be disappointed, for if you had known her, you would have liked her as much as I have come to like her. Now, Jane had never heard of any of the unpleasant gossip about Miss Blakely, for she was one of those people, and there are, young and old, some who never seem to hear any disagreeable things that are said about other people. And one day, as Jane came home from school, she passed that big iron gate and thought of Miss Blakely living all by herself in that big house, and she thought Miss Blakely must be awfully lonely. I think maybe I'll go in and see her someday, tomorrow if Mother will let me, and I know what I'll do. I'll take her one of Julia's eggs. Now, Julia was Jane's pet hen, and she thought that one of her eggs would be just about the nicest present she could take that poor, old, lonely lady. So the next day, having obtained her mother's permission, Jane set out to make her neighborly call. She found the gate open, fortunately, and she walked in and looked at all the bare trees and shrubbery and thought what a lovely place it must be in summer. Then she walked up to the big front door and rang the bell. The door was opened by the stern-looking maid who stared down on this unexpected little visitor. But Jane looked up with her engaging smile and asked if she might see Miss Blakely, please. And after a moment's hesitation, she was told to come in. So Jane walked into the big library, filled with dark mahogany furniture and endless rows of books, and she looked around and wondered why they kept the window shades pulled down so tight. She thought it would be much nicer to let the sunlight in, and she sat on the edge of a huge chair and waited for Miss Blakely to come. In a few minutes, she heard her coming, and Jane stood up like a polite little girl and saw Miss Blakely standing in the doorway. "How do you do?" said Jane pleasantly. "I've been wanting to come to see you for ever so long. We've moved, you know, into the bungalow at the end of the street." But Miss Blakely stood stock still and looked Jane over from head to foot with her lips pressed together in a rigid line and made no reply. "Well, maybe you've seen me sometimes standing outside and looking in through your gate," pursued Jane in a friendly tone, wondering why Miss Blakely did not come in and be more sociable. "But probably you haven't, or you would have called me to come in." Miss Blakely narrowed her eyes while Hannah, the maid, standing behind her mistress, rubbed her hands nervously together, hoping that Miss Blakely wouldn't hurt Jane's feelings. "And I have brought you a present," Jane went on, blissfully unaware of her frigid reception. "A present?" snapped Miss Blakely, at last finding her voice and also her eyeglasses, which she popped onto her sharp nose. "What kind of present do you think you could bring me, you silly little girl?" Now, Jane had never been called silly before by anybody, and she stopped just a moment to consider, and then decided that Miss Blakely probably didn't know much about children and thought they all must be silly. "I have brought you one of Julia's eggs," she said pleasantly, stepping forward and holding out her hand. "One of what?" asked Miss Blakely in a sharp, astonished voice. "One of Julia's eggs," repeated Jane. "You see, she's my pet hen, and we think her eggs are just about the best there are." "How perfectly ridiculous," said Miss Blakely, still standing in the doorway with her hands on her hips. "Did you ever hear of anything more ridiculous? I suppose your mother put you up to this." "Oh, no," said Jane promptly and somewhat crestfallen. "I asked Mother if I might come, but she doesn't even know that I brought you an egg. But if you don't want any, why, of course I'll go." "You should never have come," was Miss Blakely's sharp reply, motioning Hannah to open the front door. "And when I want you to come again, I'll let you know." So Jane walked down those steps once more with Julia's egg in her hand. But as she went home, she did not call Miss Blakely all kinds of names, hard old thing, nasty old woman, mean old crosspatch, but she just tried to think what was the matter and felt sorrier than ever for poor Miss Blakely. And she decided in her mind what the matter was. And the next day, when she saw Miss Blakely driving downtown slowly in her old-fashioned carriage, she ran out, waving her hand, and the coachman pulled up the horses. And coming up with her sweetest smile to Miss Blakely, Jane said, "I'm sorry I went to see you yesterday when you felt sick, but when you feel better, I'd like to come again, and maybe you'll be glad to see me then." And though Jane didn't know it, when Miss Blakely drove away, she had certain thoughts in her heart that she hadn't had before. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kirk and then to Scott to finish our tale.
Well, after that, whenever Jane saw Miss Blakely out driving, and that was nearly every pleasant day, Jane would nod and smile and wave her hand as if they were the best of friends. And for the life of her, Miss Blakely couldn't help returning these pleasant salutations. You know, you can't keep on scowling at a person who persists in smiling at you. So by and by, Miss Blakely actually began to smile back at Jane, until one day, when they met quite a distance from Jane's home, Miss Blakely told William to stop the carriage. And she really did invite Jane to get in and be driven home. And Jane wasn't a bit slow in accepting that invitation. And she settled down in that carriage beside Miss Blakely just as if she had been doing that all her young life. "How is it," began Miss Blakely, "that I don't see you with your mother? You always seem to be by yourself." "Oh, didn't you know that Mother gives music lessons to lots of children?" said Jane. "She's helping to pay for our bungalow, and I'm helping too." "You are helping to pay for a house?" said Miss Blakely, her eyes dwelling curiously on her little companion. "Yes," said Jane, "if that were the most natural thing in the world. You see, it's like this. I saved up my money and bought Julia. Now she is the most wonderful layer, Mother says, that ever was. And I sell the eggs and put the money with what Mother makes, and as Father says, every little helps. He says goodness only knows when we will get it all paid for. But I tell him that if eggs will only stay night, For when I get a whole dozen, it seems like an awful lot of money." "Was it one of those eggs you brought me the other day?" asked Miss Blakely. "Yes," said Jane. "I wanted you to have one. You see, Julia is really and truly mine. And so when I give away one of her eggs, I give away something that is really and truly mine. And I think it is the nicest thing to give." "I see," said Mrs. Blakely. And she did. She saw something that she hadn't seen for a long time, and she bent her eyes down on Jane's yellow head, and they were different eyes entirely from those which had first seen Jane. "Where have you been?" continues Miss Blakely. "You are quite a long way from home." "Yes," said Jane, "it is quite a way. I've been to see one of our families." "One of your families," said Miss Blakely. "Have you got relatives or cousins living around here?" "Oh, no," laughed Jane. "I didn't mean that. All our relatives live a long way from here. But you see, Christmas is coming, and we think the best part of Christmas is taking things to families that otherwise wouldn't have any. And we know quite a few of them. And after school, Mother lets me go and see the children, and I've been talking up Christmas with them." Just then they reached the bungalow. But as Jane got out, Miss Blakely actually said to her, "I think I'd like you to come and see me." "Oh, I'd love to come," said Jane. And a few days after, she walked up those same steps, and Hannah let her in with a smile. And when she got into that same dark library, it was all lit up, and the tea table was all spread, and there were cakes and candies on it, and 2 candles. "Why, it looks just like Christmas already," laughed Jane. "What lovely times you must have here at Christmas," she said. "I think holidays are tiresome and stupid," said Miss Blakely. "But not Christmas," said Jane, as she sat in her big chair, holding her plate carefully in her lap, munching her cake contentedly, and taking a sip of tea from her cup just as if she were a grown-up lady. "Of course, you do get a little tired. Father says if we don't stop getting so many things, he is going to make us join the Spug Society." "The Spug Society?" asked Miss Blakely. And I wish you could have seen her, leaning forward and looking with a really pleasant and most interested expression into Jane's blue eyes that just radiated friendliness. "Oh, no," laughed Jane, and I cannot tell you how good that ripple of childish laughter sounded in that great empty house. "Oh, no, not Spug Society. Those letters stand for words. And when you spell it all out, it is the Society for the Prevention of Useless Giving." But of course, Father is only joking, because we don't buy useless things for our family. We only buy useful things. "But," said Mrs. Blakely, "if you buy so many useful things for your families, as you call them, doesn't that make quite a hole in your savings? I should think it would bankrupt you." "Mother says it nearly does," Jane replied. "But it's only once a year, and you must have some fun at Christmas. So that's what you call having fun at Christmas, robbing your bank?" But then her voice trailed off so low that I couldn't hear how she ended her sentence, and I don't believe that Jane did. All I know is that a few days after that, Miss Blakely's carriage stopped in front of the Harriet bungalow, and Miss Blakely and Jane went off on a shopping expedition together. All I know is that beside Jane's little purse, there went on that expedition a very fat-looking wallet in Miss Blakely's thin hands. And all I know is that the shop people looked on in amazement as they saw these two hand in hand exploring the shops, and saw Miss Blakely loosening up her wallet in a way that surprised them. And all I know is that the week before that Christmas, the happiest girl you ever saw sat down with her mother and told her all about the wonderful, wonderful things they had gotten for the McCloskeys, the Strongs, the Courses, and the Murphys. "Oh, Mother," said Jane, after she had gotten back from the Aladdin adventure, "you should have seen it. And it never seemed once to have entered her head that all these things were for someone else. And Mother," continued Jane, "there was one thing I didn't just understand. Miss Blakely had all these things sent around to her house, and she wants me to come to see her tomorrow to talk over some plans. Don't you think she is just lovely? And I suppose that was the first time in ever and ever so long that Miss Blakely had been called lovely by anyone.
Well, the next day, Jane went again to see Miss Blakely. And this time, she just ran into that big place as if she lived there. And she just ran into that house as if it belonged to her. And she said, oh yes, she did. She just kissed Miss Blakely as if she were her aunt or something. And I wish you could have seen Hannah clasp her hands while that operation went on. But when Jane went into the library this time, she just didn't recognize it. Why, the curtains were all up. The sunshine came pouring in through those windows, and at one end of the room was a huge Christmas tree. Jane had never seen such a big one. You could not have gotten it into the bungalow. And there were wreaths in the windows with little sprigs of holly in them, and ground pine over the big picture of the Madonna and Child that hung over the fireplace. Oh, I can't begin to tell you how lovely it looked. And I wish you could have seen it, with Jane standing in the middle of the room, with clasped hands looking at it all. Why, Miss Blakely, said Jane, this looks just like a Christmas party. That is what it does look like, said Miss Blakely. We're going to have a Christmas party, and the Strongs are coming, and the Choruses, and the McCluskeys, and the Murphys, and we're going to drive around together and invite them for Christmas Eve. And then they sat down, these two, and put their heads together, Miss Blakely's and Jane's, and planned just about the most wonderful party you ever heard of. Only there was one big thing planned that our Jane didn't know anything about. And there were two people present when that plan was made. And one of them was Miss Blakely, and the other was a very professional looking man. And he came when Jane wasn't there, and he had a satchel all filled with papers, and Miss Blakely had to sign her name a good many times and hold up her hands. And then the man took away one set of papers and left another. And Miss Blakely folded them very carefully in a big envelope. And on the envelope, Miss Blakely wrote in her very best hand, "A Merry Christmas to my dear Jane from her friend, Marion Blakely." Well, all I've got to say is that they were about the merriest Christmas party you ever saw. They were all there, the McCloskeys and the Murphys and the rest of them. It's a good thing that Miss Blakely lived in a big house, because otherwise it couldn't have taken them all in. And people stared when they saw in front of Miss Blakely's aristocratic and forbidding entrance a chattering, laughing, happy crowd of boys and girls with their fathers and mothers, for of course they weren't left out. And neither were Mr. and Miss Harriet left out. They were there too. And right at the front door stood Miss Blakely and Jane together. And that was a part of Miss Blakely's plan, to greet their gifts. "You see," said Miss Blakely, "I won't know them. You will have to introduce them to me." So Jane made the introductions, and Miss Blakely said, "I wish you a very Merry Christmas." And then they all trooped into the library. And Miss Blakely didn't seem to mind a bit having the front hall all littered up with coats and sacks and hats and tam-o'-shanters, and even the snow and the mud that got on the floor from those who didn't have any rubbers to wear didn't seem to trouble her either. And then Hannah threw open wide the library doors. And when those children actually beheld the tree all ablaze with light and a glitter with decorations, they appeared spellbound. Not a word, not a sound came from them. They simply stood in silence. Nor did the grown-ups know what to do, but Jane did. "Children," she said in her direct way, "this tree is yours. You remember I told you that Miss Blakely had a just wonderful surprise for you. Well, this is it. she said, gesturing toward the shimmering tree. So you can hunt for your names, and when you find them, you must come and thank Miss Blakely, for she is about the very kindest person there is in the world. Now, Jane, protested Miss Blakely, but really, I do think that was just like Christmas music in her ears, although she pretended not to like it. Well, everybody found his name at last, and everyone came up and thanked Miss Blakely and wished her a Merry Christmas. Only they didn't need to do that, for it was plain that she was having the merriest Christmas of her life. And then the doors across the hall were flung open, and this time it was Jane who couldn't believe her eyes, for this was Hannah's Christmas secret. There was the big dining room. There was the table with lighted candles and wreaths of holly for a centerpiece, candles, and a cornucopia for each one, including the grown-ups. And then the ice cream was brought in, and it was all so wonderful, just like an Arabian Nights tale. And Jane could think, for once in her young life, of nothing whatever to say. So while they were all being served, she slipped away and went back to the library to have another peep at the tree. Suddenly, Miss Blakely was beside her. "Jane," she said, in a low, tremulous voice, "you must have missed your name." "Why, I didn't look for my name," said Jane in surprise. "Why not?" said Miss Blakely. "Didn't you expect anything?" And she looked right into Jane's face. "No," said Jane, "not with all this. It's all really been for me, you know." "So you didn't even think what you had been left out?" said Miss Blakely. "Well, you haven't been. Now you go and slip your hand in around the trunk of that tree and see what you find." And Jane did. But all she found was a long envelope with a "Merry Christmas to Jane from her friend Marion Blakely" written on it. "Why, I don't understand," said Jane, as she opened it and pulled out a long document and tried to read it. "To whom it may concern, this is to certify that the property on Bellevue Street at the corner of Center Street, bounded on the north," and so on, "with all the property and the appurtenances thereof, is hereby transferred and become the sole property of Jane Harriet, her heirs and assigns," and so forth and so on. "Miss Blakely, what is it?" cried Jane. And then Miss Blakely sat down and gathered that child into her lap and put her arms around her as they sat before that Christmas tree. "It means, dear Jane," she said, "that your bungalow is paid for. I've given it to you." "To me?" grasped Jane. "Then Father and Mother will be my boarders. Oh, isn't that funny? But dear Miss Blakely, you shouldn't have done it. It's too much. I just don't know what to say." "It's all right, dear," said Miss Blakely. "I've talked to your father and mother about it, and they have let me have my way. For, dear, you have taught me such a wonderful lesson and given me the most priceless gift." And that is the story of Miss Blakely's Christmas party. And oh, do you not see that just as those proud wise men and those haughty kings bowed before love in the manger, so Miss Blakely's, a proud and crusty soul, bowed before the love of Christ in the heart of his child? For in the end, every knee must bow to love. That is the lesson of Christmas. So to all of you, from Geoff and all he loves and his family, and from Kirk and myself, we wish you a Merry Christmas.